The house that was recently excavated seems to me exactly the sort of house that Jesus would have grown up in.
Modern-day Nazareth, location of a major new discovery. Could this be the house where Jesus lived as a boy? And what would it have been like? The Gospel of Matthew describes Joseph as a tekton, but there are different opinions about how wealthy this made him.
Interestingly, the craft of tekton was seen as somewhat below that of a peasant, someone who worked the land, because the tekton did not have the benefit of a plot of land.
The word tekton is not a technical term for carpenter. It means an artisan of some kind working in stone or wood. And so Joseph has a trade. He has a home, and he's got enough money to get betrothed and to marry a wife.
I think 100 years ago, scholars might have thought of Joseph and Mary as a poor family, as a family who were just keeping their heads above water, as it were. Whereas modern scholars are beginning to think that they had a little bit to work with.
The family of Joseph was claiming a royal descent. Obviously, the line of David was a very significant one. And so, by definition, that would tend to set them apart from others within a given village or community.
Joseph we know a bit more about than the origins of Mary.
Within the archaeological site, a series of domestic objects have been recovered. Kept in this simple cabinet, they are tangible evidence that a woman once lived here. And they give us an insight into her life.
A spindle wheel is a disc with a hole in the center, used as a weight in spinning wool or other yarn.
If you think about a woman's domestic possessions, one of the most important is going to be her spinning gear. Think of the spindle whorl. It's something that she uses every day. It's part of the fabric of her life.
Weaving was the ideal activity for an elite woman in antiquity. Had a lot of honor to it, had a lot of respectability.
Women who wove fabric were virtuous women. You were a good wife if you were making clothes for your family. So the significance of finding a spindle whorl in this house isn't just that this is part of day-to-day life. It says something about the moral character of the women who live there.
If you think about Joseph and Mary's life in Nazareth, it's entirely possible that they were involved in the kind of consumer economy that existed in Roman Galilee. And so I think you shouldn't be shocked to find objects, for example, on an archaeological site that would indicate some kind of prosperity.
Amongst the other artifacts are items of jewelry.
The bracelets from the site are probably Roman in date, although bracelets of similar form were manufactured for several centuries, so we can't be sure.
We have countless texts that suggest that a woman's appearance was important. Wealthy Jewish women no doubt wore jewelry of gold and silver, but poorer women also wore jewelry of wood or glass or metal.
Earlier work also found some glass beads at the site. These would be part of a necklace, typical of women's dress across the Roman world.
In Galilee in the 1st century, the jewelry that women wore would have been probably stuff that was locally sourced, wood or beautiful glass beads or fiber, perhaps. I think it's conceivable that Mary had jewelry on, that she used to wear jewelry.
Earlier finds from the site include a series of metal rods with flattened ends, which probably are makeup spatulas.
If you were a woman in the first century in a rural place like Galilee, you probably wouldn't want makeup on all the time when you went laboring in the fields, for instance. It would have been reserved for special occasions, perhaps for feast days.
It's fair to think of a woman from a family of craftsmen, for example, as having access to at least a modest amount of cosmetics.
A woman's life in first century Nazareth was centered on the home and her children.
Mary, like most Jewish women, would have spent her day providing for her family, which would have included weaving, fetching water, and cooking.
Mary, as a Jewish woman of the first century, would have been responsible for Jesus' religious upbringing. So she would have introduced him to basic moral questions, how to be a good person.
If Joseph was away practicing his trade, the person who would be raising the children in the fear of the Lord would have been Mary herself.
She might have sung the Psalms to him. She might have told him life lessons using biblical stories, much as people do today. Mary would have been responsible for teaching Jesus what it meant to be a Jew and how to live your life in accordance with God's plan.
But beyond the safety of the house where he was raised, the world of Jesus' childhood was in turmoil. Modern-day Nazareth, location of an archaeological site believed by some to be the very house where Jesus was raised. What appears to be a house built into the side of a hill with a courtyard and multiple rooms. Though the Bible tells us very little about Jesus' childhood, we know from historical sources that turbulent events were taking place in Galilee. How might these events have influenced the man Jesus became?
Precisely because Galilee was relatively fertile, it was also a target of opportunity for the Roman occupiers.
I think Jesus would have known about the harshness of Roman rule firsthand.
Jews in the first century AD Galilee, the farmers, the artisans, the stonemasons, were among those just trying to eke out a living. They're then required to pay taxes and rent to their Roman occupiers. This would have been a massive burden on their daily life.
The most insidious thing about taxation in the Roman provinces is that it's contracted out to private individuals who bid for the job. And so there's a real motivation to bully the locals, to engage in dirty practices collecting the tax. And fundamentally, the system is prone to corruption.
They would have felt a great deal of resentment towards the Roman occupiers.
Sometime after 4 BC, a violent rebellion breaks out in a town close to Nazareth.
Over there, beyond these buildings, is the ancient city of Sepphoris. Sepphoris would have been the major city in the region, while Nazareth would have been but a small village.
Sepphoris was a very important town, 4 miles or so from Nazareth. It was the capital of Roman Galilee in the first century AD.
This area here behind me was plunged into turmoil. A certain man named Judas led a rebellion against both Rome and the sons of Herod the Great. He did so by entering into the city of Sepphoris, breaking into the armory, stealing all the weapons, and arming his men.
Judas the Galilean was a famous rebel against Rome who insisted that the empire had no proper right to be ruling Israel.
We know about Judas's revolt from Josephus, who writes about it in his historical documents.
Here was a native Jew who could be king over Judea, a new Messiah that many Jews wanted to support.
Today, we cannot imagine someone going up against a force such as the Roman Empire in that way. But in Judah's time, the Romans have not been in Israel very long, relatively speaking.
For a while, it may have looked like the rebellion would have been successful. But then the Romans sent 15,000 troops down from Syria into Sepphoris to flatten the city and squash the rebellion.
I think it would be terrifying to face the Roman army. You would know that they were there to utterly destroy you.
Judas was hopelessly outclassed in military terms by the Romans.
I have a feeling after those first few Jewish rebels fell and the Roman army just continued to advance, they knew the gig was up.
The Romans leveled the city in response because it had been taken, so that everyone who saw this would understand that revolt against Rome was impossible.